Hi, Vili. It is such a pleasure to welcome you to Network Capital. We're a full stack mentorship platform. We enable millennials and Gen Zs to experiment with their careers, figure out what they want to do with their life, and then nudge them in the right direction. And essentially, it's a digital platform. So your book and your work is directly relevant to us, and how you got there, your career is even more interesting, perhaps. So let's start there. Like, tell us a bit about your early career lives, your early interests, and how did that shape your way to the Oxford Internet Institute?
Well, thanks, Utkarsh. It's great to be here. I was originally a sort of bedroom programmer, and then during the first dot-com boom, I was working at a dot-com company, and we all, as a programmer, and we all felt that our code is going to change the world. And we were all very wealthy on paper because we had stock options, and the stocks prices at that time were going through the roof. And then the dot-com bubble burst and our stock options lost their value. And I learned that it's not just technology changing society, but also the other way around. The social and economic forces shape technological development, because suddenly our code wasn't worth anything anymore and it was taken offline. And then through various different steps from there, I ended up doing a PhD in economic sociology and pursuing an academic career at the intersection of economy, society, and technology.
And what is your new book about? How did you start working on that?
So my new book is called Cloud Empires: How Digital Platforms Are Overtaking the State and How We Can Regain Control. And it highlights findings from past 6-7 years of research by my research group at the Oxford Internet Institute, where I work as professor of economic sociology and digital social research. And the reason I wrote the book is because through our research, we found out about ways in which these very large platform companies, digital platforms through which we do much of our business and everyday life these days, how their rules shape basically who wins and who loses, and how you have to conduct yourself to succeed. And I knew that not a lot of people and not a lot of businesses realize this, even though it has a very tangible effect on their success in the digital economy. So part of the reason for me to write this book, and write it in a way that it should be as interesting and as accessible as possible to the intelligent general reader, part of the motivation was to basically bring these learnings from research to benefit people who are looking to do business online, people who are looking to work online, and just people who are internet users in today's world, and therefore are touched by the digital giants.
It's fascinating. And the book is structured as a series of stories and case studies. How did you decide the format and the structure of the book?
So partly it comes from my studies in storytelling, starting from back 20 years ago. I took a course in creative writing and storytelling, and then more recently I've taken some additional courses in that, because I believe that storytelling is a little bit like a protocol in the computer world. For computers, we have to format our messages in a certain way. We have to use a certain protocol for the information to go through, right? You have to have a certain file format. And in the same way, I believe that the human mind has evolved to take in information in a certain format, according to a certain protocol. And that protocol is the structure of a story. You can find the same kinds of structures across different cultures and throughout history. And if you know what those protocols, what those structures are, I believe that you can more effectively communicate information, and the people in the receiving end will be able to absorb that information better. So I wanted to deliver all this scientific information in this way that's maybe new to scientific writing, but it's actually very old in terms of human history. So that's why it's a sort of like an economic history of the digital economy, right? So the story starts from the 1980s cyber bazaars, and then every chapter we move closer to the present day, and we learn about the sort of trials and triumphs of the various founders as they aspire to shape the digital economy. And every chapter, it tells you about the history of a specific iconic pivotal platform. It also tells you about the social science of why they failed or why they succeeded or why often things worked out differently from what they thought. And it conveys all this information in the form of stories.
And these are fascinating stories. And you touch upon aspects in the book that are easy to overlook for the uninitiated, for somebody who's not paying too much attention to, the sociological or the historical or the economic historical side of things. So let's try and figure out what the problem statement is in the book. So, for platforms like Amazon and others that have, collectively increased the GDP of the internet, they have, enabled a lot of transactions to take place. But in a way, I understand from your argument is that they are behaving more as states and less as digital platforms. So could you comment on that? And what are some ways in which companies are starting to behave more like perhaps nation states?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, if we go back to, and this also is another motivation for why I wrote the book, I got on the internet in the 90s, as I'm sure a lot of perhaps your listeners did as well. And at that time, there was this excitement about how the internet is enabling this new social order and this new access to markets where individuals are empowered and entrepreneurs are empowered, and there are no gatekeepers. Internet was circumventing brick and mortar gatekeepers and creating that way new opportunities for small businesses and for individuals. And then fast forward to the present day, we are realizing that actually these very large internet platforms are acting as gatekeepers whose rules determine what sort of business is permitted and what sort of business is not permitted. So we've gone from this sort of circumvention of gatekeepers and empowering of individuals to basically the opposite conclusion. And so the kind of one underlying motivation for this book was to kind of answer the question of why did that happen and what should we do about that. And so as you mentioned, the argument is sort of that these companies like Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, Google, and also smaller platforms that enable marketplaces, they have become something comparable to the state, but in the digital domain. And what I mean by comparable to the state is that they enforce contracts. If something goes wrong in a digital transaction, do you go to the public court? Probably not. I mean, the transaction costs and the delays are too high to actually solve the case through lawyers and courts. Instead, you complain to the platform. The platform's representative investigates, adjudicates, sanctions the offender, and hopefully provides some restitution to the victim. And this is a very classic function of the state. And now the platforms are performing it. And there's a wide range of different state-like functions that they're performing, including certifying learning. So we have all these different certificates from, Amazon Web Services certified engineer to Google and Microsoft and other certificates, which are kind of then starting to step into the territory of publicly regulated education providers, universities and schools, in terms of providing and certifying the learnings that allow you to get a job. And again, they're kind of stepping into the state territory there.
And I think there are many other things that you point out in the book, which makes me think of Amazon and even platforms like Etsy very differently than I looked at. If there's a slight point of departure, most techno optimists will look at these platforms and simply look at how much of, say, consumer surplus they're adding and how efficient they've made things, but they're not looking at it that how slowly they are becoming the ultimate adjudicators of not just economic life but society as well. But can't people who are not happy with the way they've been adjudicated by a particular company complain to the state and perhaps take them to task?
Yeah, well, maybe it's important to note, so why is this a problem in the first place, right? I know I pointed out that they're becoming state-like, and on the one hand that's great, because that, as you mentioned before, that enables business. The way how they enforce contracts and resolve disputes makes it possible for strangers across the internet in two different countries to actually engage in transactions, right? And it enables these wonderful marketplaces. I'm from Finland originally, and now in Finland there's a big mobile app development industry, and that's all thanks to Apple and Google creating marketplaces where Finnish businesses can sell apps to consumers all around the world, and both consumers and the developers can feel safe, that they will not get defrauded when they do that. So there's that's the positive side. So where's the problem? Well, like any state that is not accountable to its people, there's a temptation for the state officials and the elite to start abusing that power to tilt the playing field and to benefit their own interests, instead of just providing a wonderful, fair business environment for everyone. So just to give one well-known example, since we're talking about Apple and app developers, the most popular music app on Apple App Store for many years was Spotify, which is a Swedish app. It's developed in Sweden. And so whenever you'd search for Spotify, whenever you'd search for music in Apple App Store, the #1 search result is Spotify. This was the case for many years. Then in 2019, Apple releases its own competing product called Apple Music, right? The next day, when you go on App Store, you search for music, Spotify is no longer #1. It's not #2. It's not even #3. It's number 23, behind all kinds of apps that have nothing to do even with music. So Apple had used its state-like control over this marketplace, this transnational marketplace, to disappear a competitor. And this is a problem. And this is something where where I feel that we need to do something about. Now, your question was, well, can't Spotify in this case, or any internet citizen who is not happy with how the platforms treat them, can they just complain to their government, and then the government regulates the company, and then everything is good? I mean, this is how things normally work, right? If companies abuse their power, and if they are in such a dominant position that it's not possible for the users to just the consumers or businesses to vote with their feet, then the government will step in and regulate. And the EU has become, as you know, very active in issuing new regulations for the space. We have the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, as an upcoming Data Act, and so on and so on. Also, the Indian government, in fact, has been quite proactive, for instance, in regulating e-commerce. And this is good as far as it goes, but there's a number of problems with it that I discuss in quite a lot of detail in the book. But the common cause, I think, of these problems is that whilst governments, their jurisdiction is territorial, and their mandate to regulate, as well as their ability to regulate, is based on the idea that they have control over a territory, a specific part of the surface of the earth. Whereas with these digital platforms, the whole point almost is that they make it possible for us to do business across different jurisdictions, to do transnational business, to sell globally. And in this situation, first of all, the governments don't always have so much of an interest in the problems of the platform users, because the businesses that are active, like let's say app developers in a particular platform, they're spread around the world. And whilst in total there might be millions, within the jurisdiction of any particular government, they might actually be quite a small interest group. And that government might have more pressing issues to deal with. And the concerns of some obscure platform user group are not necessarily at the top of their concerns. Now, in some cases, like I mentioned, the EU government has been proactive because there are enough businesses, there's enough consumers in the EU who've started to make a noise about this. And then the challenge becomes, well, you can regulate it for the part that touches on your territory. But as mentioned, this is transnational business. So are your rules then going to apply to the rest of the world as well? We talk about this as the Brussels effect, right? That the Brussels can set the rules for, and then the entire internet has to follow them. And this is not great either, because there are a lot of people in different places around the world who don't necessarily agree with the rules that are emanating out of Brussels. And so I don't think this is a very, this is the future, you know, how things will work out in the future. And there's other issues as well, but I'll leave it at that for now. So the government regulation is needed, it's good, but it's not the ultimate solution, I think.
Right. What are the differences between nation states and these platforms that are beginning to behave like nations?
Yeah. Well, the key difference really is in the shape of the jurisdiction, right? The similarities, they enforce contracts, they enforce property rights, they regulate markets, they prevent market failures, they certify skills, they categorize products, they protect, they catch cyber criminals. So there are all these similarities, but the key difference is in the shape of the jurisdiction. Nation states or states are part of the definition in international law is that they control a contiguous piece of territory, and their jurisdiction is territorial. For these cloud empires, as I call them, their jurisdiction is not territorial, it's personal. It applies to any business or any person who has placed themselves under their authority in a given market, in a given industry. And that is where their value comes from. They're able to create this sort of a transnational institutional environment where the same laws, the same rules apply to an app developer or an online merchant or a Twitch streamer or whatever, regardless of whether their customers are, you know, in Finland or in the UK or in India or any other place. And that lowers the barriers to trade, that lowers the so-called non-tariff barriers that exist to business between different countries. And it creates this sort of like a business environment in the cloud, a transnational institutional environment. And so that's the difference. They're kind of non-overlapping jurisdictions.
It's fascinating. Let's try and see, say, a platform like Etsy, which is empowering,
Yes.
say, others to come together. Should Etsy be proactively thinking about how to regulate itself, how to collaborate with the government, or is there something inherent about any cloud empire which sort of inevitably becomes a kind of a nation state if it becomes too successful?
Well, so you know, they can work with governments, but then again, the question is which government, because you're active in I don't know what the numbers are for Etsy, but you know, Amazon Marketplace has consumers in I think 180 countries around the world. Apple App Store likewise serves most countries in the world. 90% of transactions on Upwork, the online freelancing marketplace, are between a buyer and a seller in 2 different countries. 90% of sellers on eBay export to foreign countries. So in this kind of situation, and the question, well, if you're a digital platform company, well, which government should you place yourself under?
Maybe a digital United Nations or something. Heaven knows.
Yeah, I mean, it would be wonderful if we could if all the nations the territorial nation states could come together and regulate the internet as a whole. And while they're at it, they should also fix climate change. But the trouble is, at the moment, international collaboration, in the sense of collaboration between states, is not advancing. It's in fact
falling down, perhaps.
Yeah, it's falling down. We have hot war in Europe. We have hopefully not, but it looks like a cold war brewing between China and the West, and none of these things bode well for our ability, for states' ability to come together and collectively regulate the internet. And so into this kind of gap, this institutional void, people still need order on the internet. People still need somebody to enforce contracts, even transnationally. And so into this gap, the cloud empire step. And how then, my argument, obviously, in the book is, well, let's look at what happened historically. What happened? We've been here before. We've been before in a situation where, out of anarchy, order is established by some entity, or centralized powerful entity that can impose order, and that way provide a great peaceful environment for commerce to flourish, but then also impose their own will on it and abuse that power on occasion. We've seen that across history and across cultures many times. Now, I've studied it in the context of European history and European Middle Ages, but it's happened elsewhere as well. And what you see in Europe, but I think also in many other cases, is that the people, what I call the digital middle class that you referenced before, that is the people who start to become prosperous on these marketplaces, the successful app developers, the successful merchants, the successful streamers and influencers. They realize that actually my ability to carry on my trade, to earn a living, is entirely dependent on the goodwill of this platform company's management, what I call the platform princes. people like Bezos or now Musk on Twitter or Zuckerberg, who basically are these autocrats who get to decide what happens on the platform. They don't even have to listen to their shareholders very much because of the corporate governance structures, and these companies tend to be very centralized. So this middle class, these digital burghers, they live constantly in the fear that next morning there's an announcement. When they wake up, there's an email in the inbox from the platform where they do their business saying, sorry, the kind of thing that you do to make your living out of actually is not allowed anymore. We've made a slight change to our terms of service, and sorry, you're out of business. And this is the exact opposite of what the internet was supposed to deliver, right? This no gatekeepers, freedom to do your own thing. From that to a situation where you're at the mercy, your business takes place at the mercy of some emperor. And so they're starting to realize this, and they're starting to organize, and they're starting to push back. So just to give one example, which I think you're well aware of, you referenced Etsy, the online crafts marketplace. 30,000 Etsy sellers got together this April, and they went on strike to protest against the platform's leadership, increasing the taxes on the platform, increasing their take of every transaction. And they called it the Indie Merchants Guild. They call their collaborative organization, they call it the Indie Merchants Guild. And why I think this is fascinating is that in the Middle Ages, it was the merchants and the artisans who then formed guilds. And then those guilds started pushing back against the feudal lord's power, saying, actually, we want, first of all, protection from arbitrary expropriation, that the prince can just come in and say, I'm taking your business, or I'm imprisoning you. So they formed guilds to mutually protect each other from such things. And then they started gradually demanding a greater and greater say also in how the marketplaces where they applied their trade were being run. And now we see something very similar in, I think, starting to happen in the digital platform economy, where this middle class has started to form these guilds to mutually protect each other from the expropriations of the feudal lord. And they're starting to also demand a say in how the platforms are being run, which I have another story in the book.
Would you call yourself a blockchain optimist or a blockchain skeptic? Because a lot of the arguments that are advanced by that that section of internet users would they want to agree with you?
Absolutely, right? Yeah. No, so I think their diagnosis is exactly right. Right, this idea that Web 2 has become controlled by these centralized platforms, which are gatekeepers, and we have to rely on them, and they're not accountable to the users, and they own everything in the end. I think their diagnosis is absolutely right. And also, if we go back to kind of so this is the kind of Web 2, Web 3 discourse, but if we go back to a few years ago when there was discussion of enterprise blockchain, right? Use of blockchain for logistics, for transportation, for supply chain management. There also the kind of concern was, these businesses, they wanted the benefits of digitalization, of assigning digital identities to all their goods and shipments and things like that. But they'd seen from other industries that once you digitalize your business, then there's a high likelihood that all the data ends up flowing to Google. And you suddenly have this digital intermediary that is starting to kind of envelop your business and insert itself as the de facto broker and ruler and gatekeeper in your business. So businesses wanted the benefits of digitalization, but they didn't want their data to fall under the control of the Silicon Valley giants. And then the kind of enterprise blockchain vendors pitch was, well, blockchain will fix this. It will give you the benefits of digitalization without those intermediaries. And so I think, again, the diagnosis was right. As for the solution, I have this chapter in the book that documents, it's a kind of history of Bitcoin and Ethereum, and documents this attempt to provide this new decentralized trustless solution, which would render those gatekeepers and intermediaries unnecessary, and instead have this decentralized network of nodes take care of enforcing the rules on the network. But it turns out that this is a failure. And in fact, even in this decentralized system, an ostensibly decentralized system, you have centralized sites of power that in the end the users end up relying on, whether mining corporations or exchanges or core software developers. So in the end, we have not, blockchain and Web3 have not solved this problem of centralized gatekeepers. They just merely managed to obscure who the gatekeepers are. So in their attempt to address the problem of autocracy, but without relying on democracy, they end up, in my argument, creating a cryptocracy, which means rule by the unknown, hidden rule. So it's from out of the frying pan and into the fire kind of situation is my assessment of the current state of blockchain and Web3.
So clearly a long way to go. I just want to double click a bit on change, whether it comes from people protesting on a digital platform, or the digital merchants guild or indie merchants guild, something like that. Who really, historically speaking, creates change? Is it the middle class? Is it the elite? Is it the downtrodden? And what does that mean in the cloud empire space or the digital platform space?
So since I'm an economic sociologist, in the kinds of theory that we use, we always find the engine, not always, but often the engine of change is somehow in economic interests and economic power. And first of all, the economic interests explain why these cloud empires rise in the first place. It's the same reason why the centralized state and the nation state arises, because business needs some kind of institutional underpinnings to work. If there's no contract enforcement, if there's no trust, then it's impossible to do business on a large scale. You can do business in a small scale in a community with people whom you trust personally, but that doesn't scale. So in economic history, we have always the same pattern where when economies grow and markets grow, that growth goes hand in hand with the emergence of a centralized entity that underpins the rules in that market. And the same has now happened on the internet. So that's the first stage. Then the second stage, some people start getting wealthy on these new markets. Since the markets grow, they create opportunities, they create business. And then we have this emergence of a wealthy middle class. We also have the emergence of the downtrodden, which in the medieval European class system, they are the peasants. They work the land. They are essential in feeding the entire society, but they are so impoverished and so deprived that whenever they try to rebel against the feudal lords and against the princes, their rebellions are easily put down, and the results are very unhappy. instead, the middle class, once they start growing prosperous enough, they start to have wealth, they start to have connections, they start to have learning, also very important, they start to have learning and cultural competence to challenge the feudal lords. They start to have allies outside that societal system, powerful allies, whether mercenaries or religious organizations or other feudal lords. And then they muster all this, all these resources, all this capital, and then they start to push essentially for greater political rights and democracy and more equal sharing of the power, and not just the princes at the top having all the power. So it's the economic, basically it's economic forces once again, because once the middle layer starts to have more economic power and starts to demand. And you see this in developmental economics as well. In there's many theories of democratization, but the simplest and often most one that is often best able to account for actual democratization processes is that when wealth is more equally distributed, not just at the top, there's the middle layer, then democracy follows, and vice versa. Whereas as long as all the economic resources are at the top, then it's very hard for political power to become democratized either, even if formally you have in principle democratic institutions like voting. If all the economic resources are very concentrated in one place, then they are able to capture the democratic system. But now I diverge a little bit. And please feel free to interrupt me, by the way, if I go a little bit in the different direction.
I love tangents, and it's very important. I was wondering, just building on top of it, do you think Marx is relevant to digital platforms and cloud empires?
So Marx is a 19th century socialist thinker and doer. And in the platform economy today, we have a lot of sort of activism and interest around labor movements, right? Around gig workers.
The tech left.
And there are in the platform. I talked about the peasants in the medieval economy, the agricultural labor force. In my analogy, we have a similar class in the platform economy. So that's everyone whose menial labor is essential to keeping the platform economy running, but who are nevertheless not sharing in very much in its benefit. So we have gig workers, we have social media moderators, we have data labelers who teach AI.
A basic job, yeah.
Exactly, they're very, very important jobs, but often not very well paid, and the working conditions can be bad. And so these people are trying to organize, and I have studied that a lot with my colleague Dr. Alex Wood, and I have a chapter in the book about these digital peace workers who are moderating social media and who are training the AI, attempting to kind of come together and campaign for better working conditions. But just like the medieval peasants, unfortunately, they are so impoverished that they just lack the resources to put up a very big fight. They cannot take very many risks. They cannot take the risk of being delisted from the platform because they're entirely dependent on the platform for their livelihoods, and so on and so on. And for these reasons, the kind of labor movement, the kind of things that Marx talks about, a working class revolution, a working class sort of movement, is, in my opinion, in my analysis, it's too early for that in the platform economy, because we are still in the Middle Ages. So historically in Europe, in the Middle Ages, you get the middle, what in Marxist theory is sometimes called the gradual bourgeois democratic revolution, which means this middle class standing up and demanding political rights for themselves, and they win political rights for themselves. And then we have at the beginning of the 19th century a system of government which affords political rights to landed wealthy people, essentially, or the property owning class. And then into this picture comes the labor movement and demands that these political rights are expanded to the entire population and not just to the property owning elites. So the labor movement, and Marx plays an important part historically in expanding democratic rights to the entire population, but we're too early for that because we don't yet have the wedge of the middle class demanding political rights from the feudal lords to the middle class. So in this analysis, they're too early, and I think the experience that we're seeing with gig workers' attempts to organize partly corresponds with this. Now, I don't want to discourage them. I mean, they have also won victories for themselves, particularly when they ally with national policymakers. And this is more doable in kind of local gig work, like delivery drivers who can organize locally. It's more difficult to do in digital labor, like moderation, which can be supplied from everywhere in the world. But then we have in the kind of, you mentioned tech clash, we have a slightly, in my views, related but slightly different phenomenon is the tech workers themselves organizing, right? So not the contractors who are working as gig workers on platforms, but the software developers, product managers who work as employees in large Silicon Valley companies. And obviously, they also in the past few years have started increasingly to organize and to unionize. And this is very interesting, and they can form a very powerful sort of counterforce to the top management sometimes, because we've had these walkouts, right, at Google, at Amazon, at Apple. We've had these walkouts where the tech workers protesting the top management decisions on some issues, often related to gender equity or such things. They protested and they do a walkout, and they can change sometimes the top management's policies. But I would say that they are still a pretty elite. They're more in the bourgeois layer. They're more in the middle class layer. They are very well earning, very well-to-do workers. And so in my analysis, they are kind of the historical analogy for them is that they are the state bureaucrats. They are the state civil servants who keep the machinery, the administration of the platform economy running. And it is the case historically also that the civil servants, often being well educated and educated in law in the past, now in programming, they often joined movements to resist the autocracy of their own head of state. So if your head of state is an emperor and you don't like the way that they are too autocratic, then you ally with the rest of the middle class to actually demand a greater political rights. And I feel like that is in some ways what is happening.
Awesome. We've covered quite a bit of ground. I just want to conclude today's discussion with some recommendations of perhaps a better policy or a more fair cloud empires, or however they might exist. So what would be your considered set of recommendations to one, these builders of cloud empires, and then the regulators who are on the other side, and to the participants?
So my first advice is to the small businesses who are on these platforms to get organized, to join the WhatsApp groups and the social media groups of other small businesses who are doing business on the same platform, to share information, share tips, and to mount campaigns when necessary to get the platform leaders to change their minds when they're proposing policies that would hurt the business. Because at the moment, there is a perverse situation where small businesses might actually be prevented from collectively negotiating with the mega platform company because it might be considered a cartel. So competition law might actually protect the platform giants against the smaller businesses. We've talked about this to EU policymakers, and this is something that EU policymakers have said that they will look into how to address this. And then my third piece of advice is to the people who build platform cloud empires, the rulers, including the user's voice in the decision making could actually improve also the quality of their decisions. Apple, when it regulates the App Store, sometimes it issues a new rule, and this new rule ends up having some unintended consequences. It was intended to fight some spam, but it ends up also disallowing some legitimate business, and now actually completely unnecessarily some legitimate business in the App Store is hurt. If there was a better way of including those small businesses' voice in the decision making, then this kind of problems could be avoided. And think about it, how democratic states do it. When they're proposing a new law or regulation, they say, hey, we are thinking of regulating this area. What do you think? You have 2 months to send in your opinions. And they gather data from what different businesses and civil society groups think about this matter. And that allows them to avoid any unintended consequences and pitfalls. So that's the first stage. The second stage is, you could have a representative body of the users on your platform who is empowered to actually represent the user base in the decision making of the company. So in the book, I talk about a game developer, a game company that does this. They have 500,000 players in a game. And when the players are upset about something, they send lots of angry customer service emails to the company. And the company just gets overwhelmed. They can't deal with all that input, and it's not very useful. So instead, what they did was and they've been doing this for 10 years already. It's very successful. They said to the players, look, you're 500,000 people, elect a representative body of 13 members. And then that 13 members comes to meet us, the top management. Every year, they have an annual meeting where they go through the players' problems, what problems they have. And then they also discuss the company's plans going forward. And what's especially exciting about this is that those 13 people, those representatives, they can be under NDA and they can receive confidential information about the future plans of the company. And they can give the player view on the future plans of the company. Because often the companies say, well, we can't really do like governments do, where we tell beforehand what we're going to do because it's a competitiveness, it's a market trade secret and so on. But you don't have to tell it to all the users. Just have a representative body that has the mandate and has the legitimacy to represent user voice and run your plans through them and spot any obvious issues before they become a problem with your user base and you have a huge PR crisis in your hands. So my final advice is that also the platform giants, it would be in their own interest to start to formalize ways of taking in the user and especially the small business voice into their decision making.
That is a fascinating note to end this particular podcast. I learned so much from reading your book, your papers, and hosting it today on Network Capital. Your book is not only academically rich, but it's also very accessible. I hope lots and lots of people will read it. We'll attach the link of the book, and also we'll put it as our reading recommendation for the month. Thank you so much, Vili. I look forward to meeting you in Oxford.
Thank you so much, Utkarsh. It was a fascinating discussion. Looking forward to seeing you again soon.